Join me as we head down to the Caribbean for a cruise that will take us from the port in Miami to Amber Cove in the Dominican Republic, then on to Grand Turk and Turks and Caicos. En route, we'll eat to our heart's content as we sail through the majestic waters of the Eastern Caribbean, also enjoying a variety of onboard entertainment, including shows, lounging around, and some mini-golf with my friends. Onshore, we'll take excursions exploring the island towns and cities along our journey, as well as swim in the crystal blue waters and relax on beach chairs tanning in the sun. So welcome on board as we get ready to set sail. Greetings from an Eastern Caribbean cruise. We start the trip off by taking a very reasonably priced Uber to LAX just after rush hour. Back on a oneworld carrier, I arrived well in advance of my flight, able to enjoy the perks of my airline status. After breezing through security, I made my way up to the Admirals Club. I was happy with the variety of light food available, which is included in the membership, including the fresh-made guacamole they're known for. Then it was time to board, and though it was a full flight and I wasn't upgraded, the person sitting next to me was, so I had the row to myself. The premium economy seats were more like business class ones on most domestic flights, so I had plenty of room to stretch out and sleep for most of the flight. We approached Miami for a scenic sunrise landing, after which I had some time to kill before I could board the train I was taking, so I went to the lounge there for some breakfast. The avocado toast with lox was certainly a highlight. It was then time for me to make my way out of the airport. I took the convenient Miami Mover, which was a short automated people mover which takes you from the terminal to the rental car center and train station. After paying the $7.50 fare, I collected my ticket and hopped on the Tri-Rail, which is a commuter train that links Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach. I took an upper-level seat so that I can have an elevated view during the journey. The ride was pleasant and makes travel up the southeastern coast of South Florida very convenient. After about an hour and 20-minute ride, I arrive at Delray, where my friends and I are staying before heading down to the port the next day. In the evening, my friends arrive, and since one of them had their sunscreen confiscated by TSA, we stop off at Publix, and while there I pick up one of their pub subs, which I've heard so much about. After trying it, I see why people talk about it so much. When leaving the parking lot, we saw a Carvel ice cream store, something we hadn't seen since we were kids, so we had to have some. I personally had the pistachio soft serve, which I thought was great. We then headed out onto the main strip on Atlantic Avenue, where the area was teeming with nightlife. For a little background on this particular trip, my college friends and I have been traveling to a different city on football's championship weekend for 24 years now, so when we saw a Jersey Shore-themed retro arcade, being from there, we knew that that was the place for us. For $10, they had all-you-could-play games, including my favorite, skee-ball. There were also a ton of pinball machines, bubble and air hockey, a bar, and classic arcade games. It was everything we could have asked for. As we headed back to the car, we soaked in the quirky street life the strip put on display before calling it an early night by Florida standards. The next morning, it was time for us to head to the ship port, so we split in Uber for the about an hour's ride to the cruise terminal. The check-in was smooth, and after winding our way through the boarding area, we pretty quickly found ourselves on our floating home for the next few days. Since we couldn't check into our room right away, our first stop was at Guy's Burger Joint, where we enjoyed some cheeseburgers as we killed some time before we could put our things away. Once 1:30 came around, we checked into our rooms, and though it's not for everyone, having a windowless room can provide darkness, allowing you to sleep in without being woken up by the sunrise. That, combined with being in the front of the bottom deck, is a great way to save some money if you don't mind it, or similar to me, and actually like it. After putting away our things, it was time to head to the top deck to watch as we set sail. For those that wanted to participate, there was a party on the deck for departure. The music was a nice soundtrack for me to listen to as I watched us leave the port and begin the journey out to sea. After walking around for a bit to familiarize ourselves with the ship, we made our way down to dinner. The first night, I chose shrimp cocktail, fried calamari, and a cured salmon with dill cream and lemon dressing for an appetizer. The main dish was a strip loin steak, followed by a tiramisu dessert. After dinner, we checked out a show at the comedy club with a comedian who was ironically on the previous cruise I was on with this company, though the larger crowd on this ship provided the energy needed for a much better show. The next morning, I woke up late for our leisurely day at sea. It began with a nice cup of coffee, followed by a workout at the gym to burn off some of the calories I was inevitably going to consume during the course of this trip. And speaking of those calories, for lunch we had Guy's Pig and Anchor, a treat that's only available on the days at sea. As it was Sunday of the big football game, whose name shall go unmentioned since it's copyrighted, we checked out the myriad of places to watch that game, a luxury of not really caring for either of the teams playing. We ultimately chose the Lido deck to settle in at, and it turned out to be a pretty good game. After the game, we decided to play mini golf on the ship. The sheer amount of wind made it a bit challenging, but we modified the rules to play it hockey style, where you didn't have to wait for the ball to settle before taking a stroke. It ended up being a lot of fun, but sadly, I didn't win. The next morning, we woke up with the ship docked at our first port of call on the trip, Amber Cove in the Dominican Republic. We disembark and make our way down the dock to the port town. It's there that we meet up for the tour that we booked, which will take us to the nearby city of Puerto Plata, the third largest city in the country. The first stop on the tour was the Ron Macarick's Rum Factory. The tour included a short movie about the history of the factory, followed by a tasting where they did not skimp on the alcohol in the slightest. We sampled about 8 different rums, and the pours were quite long. At about 9 a.m. on an empty stomach, that was certainly a brilliant way to loosen up the crowd for the rest of a fun tour. Though I should note, one of my friends is sober and didn't have anything to drink, but he still had a great time on this tour. After the tour ended, we stopped at the gift shop where my other friend and I kept the buzz going with a mojito and pina colada, which was enough to make me think buying this hat was a good idea. Then it was on to another location where we tried some of their local drink called Mama Juana. No, it's not what you're thinking. This is a spiced drink that is made by infusing rum, red wine, and honey with tree bark and herbs to make what would be a great after-dinner beverage. By that point, we were nice and liquored up, so it was time to see the sights. The first was the Calle de las Sombrillas, or Umbrella Street. The 178 umbrellas serve as a multicolored canopy to the quaint street. It is a great spot for that perfect vacation snapshot where you can grab a local coffee or piece of chocolate. From there, it was on to Paseo de Donna Blanco, or the Pink Place. Named after Donna Blanco, who ran the hotel she and her husband started after his death while continuing to raise her 9 kids, it's another spot to soak in the vibrant colors that remind you that you are on a Caribbean vacation. Next, we sampled some local chocolate before moving on to Independence Park, which has a 2-floor Victorian gazebo in the center, and it's surrounded by historical buildings like St. Philip the Apostle Cathedral, the House of Culture, and the City Council. We stopped in a local cafe to have a coffee and empanada to soak up some of the alcohol from earlier and take in the views from the second-floor veranda. Next, it was on to the Amber Museum, which houses a large collection of fossils, plants, and ancient animals encased in amber. We made our way through the city out towards the shore where we saw the Neptune statue, before making our way out to the fort of San Felipe, a Spanish fort dating back to the late 1500s. Adjacent to that was the Puerto Plata Harbor Lighthouse, as well as some statues and monuments throughout San Felipe Park. As our excursion drew to a close, we drove back to the port, enjoying the tropical hills along the way. Once back at Amber Cove, we walked around for a little bit, took some pictures, and eventually made our way back onto the ship. That evening, we took in another comedy show and then headed midship to listen to a 70s dance party before finally calling it a night. The next morning, the sun was shining brightly over the clear waters of the next port we were docked in, Grand Turk. After the fun we had on the previous excursion in the Dominican Republic, we decided to do another one here. Unfortunately, this one was kind of disappointing. Perhaps it was the lack of alcohol, but more likely it was simply the lack of sights to see on the island. Further, the sights that we did see were somewhat depressing. It wasn't all bad though, as we had a stop on their main road where I tried some conch ceviche that I bought from a food truck, and then enjoyed it as I watched the waves hit the shoreline. Later, we stopped by their lighthouse, outside of which you could buy a carrot for $1 to feed the local donkeys. When we got back to the cruise center, we were able to enjoy the best thing about Grand Turk: lying on their beach and swimming in their waters. After a few hours of soaking up the sun on shore, it was time to head back onto the ship, where we sat on the deck and watched as the sun dipped below the horizon. The music party for that night moved outside to the Lido deck and jumped ahead a decade to the 80s, one of my favorite eras of music. Afterwards, I went for a stroll, taking in the sea air before resting up for our final day at sea. After breakfast, I channeled my inner 80-year-old man and headed down to play some bingo. Fun fact about my life, I have never once had the opportunity to yell bingo, and that did not change that day. It was fine though, as soon thereafter, all of my cares were massaged away at the Cloud9 Spa. Fully relaxed, I then went up to the deck and took in an absolutely beautiful sunset, and concluded the night and the trip with a really fun dance party with music from all different eras. In the morning, we woke up to the conclusion of our trip, back where we started in the port of Miami, where we made our way to the airport and eventually back to our respective homes. Thanks for joining my friends and I on this trip, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Until then, let's take one last look back at our Eastern Caribbean cruise.